Welcome everybody to today's session. This is the first of a four-part series on 3 supply chain capabilities to address in 2023. All righty. Again, welcome. Welcome to this four-part series. Today's the first session. We're going to be doing an overview of the 3 supply chain capabilities in 2023. What I'm going to do is we're going to take you through here, provide an introduction. My name is Jeffrey Porter. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at StockIQ Technologies. I have 30 years in software consulting leadership. I'm passionate about serving others, deep experience in supply chain, and I'm a hiking, fly fishing, and skiing enthusiast. And joining me today is Tim Wise. Pleased to have Tim on board here with Tight Lines Consulting and Coaching. Welcome, Tim. If you give a brief introduction, that'd be wonderful.
That's great, Jeffrey. Thanks. So yeah, my name's Tim Wise. I'm the Managing Director of Tight Lines Consulting and Coaching. I've got 25 years, primarily in high tech, with managing and re-engineering international supply chains. Today, I run a consulting company that helps manufacturers and distributors meet their financial and operational goals. You know, I started my career in finance, so I've got a deep finance and supply chain background. And you know, Jeffrey, I think my fish is a little bigger than your fish. So I'm gonna just claim that for my picture, okay? And
Okay.
maybe you'll have to update that later for a bigger fish. I don't know, but and fly fishing enthusiast, and looking forward to spring for sure.
Tim, I was debating about that when I put my picture up. I'm like, which one's bigger? Is it really the positioning, or is it the type of fish? What is it?
Yeah.
You know, we'll give you this one this time, and we'll see on the next one. So,
all right.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about what our topics are for today. So our topics today are back to the basics, and again, this is part 1 of a 4-part series. This is an overview that we're going to be presenting to you. We are certainly going to go through introductions, if you've just seen here, Tim, myself, 3 supply chain capabilities that we're going to be talking about in depth in these successive 3, but we're going to touch on them today, and that's forecasting and planning, supplier management, and inventory management. Following that introduction and those overview, we're going to get into the overall key takeaways. But Tim, I actually have a question for you. Where did the name Tight Lines Consulting come from in coaching? What is the genesis of that?
Well, it's my enthusiasm for fishing, right? So I grew up as a kid fishing, and Tight Lines is kind of a signature, or you know, kind of a good luck and success for fishermen. Like if you talk to another fisherman, they will say tight lines, right? Which means good luck, or and the reason it's tight lines is because when you're hooked up on fish and you're catching a fish, the lines are tight, right? And so that's how I came up with it. I've been using that for years as talking to other fishermen, but it actually resonates with other people as well. And you know, Tight Lines Consulting and Coaching, we take the slack out of your supply chain. So that's my tagline for my business, and so that was the genesis for naming that. It was just something I'm passionate about, and I like it. I don't know if anyone else does, but I like it. So
that sounds great, Tim. I think it really resonates, and I think taking the slack out is really what we're talking about in here, which is let's take the slack out of your supply chain and your processes that we put in place.
You bet.
So yeah, let's talk about back to the basics. So much noise out there: resiliency, artificial intelligence, machine learning, other more advanced strategies. I think this is kind of your basis for why you wanted to get back to the basics, and the genesis of a blog that you wrote, which was right at the beginning of January.
Yeah, you know, coming out of the pandemic, right? Everyone was talking about resiliency, and the pandemic was not a normal event, and everybody has some type of events in their supply chain as they move through their business cycles. But you know, technology's moving fast. There's many options in the marketplace to address these core processes we're talking about today. And I think these 3 areas if done well, right? So a lot of organizations are not doing these very well, or not doing them at all. And these are really the core of managing your supply chain, right? Forecasting and planning, supplier management, inventory management. And I think you can get a long way with resiliency and managing your supply chain in your business if you do these really well, right? And I think sometimes we lose sight of, hey, there is some basic blocking and tackling that we need to be doing on a consistent basis, right? Some people kind of dabble in these, or they do them ad hoc, or they have very loose policies and inventory strategies. So I think these areas are really, if you want to create better predictability and you want to be able to head off and mitigate risks in your business, these are really the areas to focus on.
Great, Tim. Yeah, and certainly if we talk about, I would call these almost distractions in the marketplace at a certain extent. Some of the technologies, I think they have their place in the market.
You bet.
I think from adapting or adopting these technologies, wonderful tools, wonderful assets, if we have those basics laid in the foundation laid.
Absolutely, they can do wonders for your business, but not if you're not doing it reasonably well to begin with, right? So that's really the genesis of why I wrote about this, because I felt like everyone was kind of trying to move away from this, and sometimes we just need to get back to the basics.
Gotcha. Yeah. As we talk to our clients, in a lot of cases, one of the things that we talk about is crawling, walking, and then running. And there's this continuous improvement. I've never met the end of an improvement process within supply chain. Sometimes it's technology, sometimes it's enhancement, sometimes it's the market driving us to get better from a service level perspective, et cetera.
You bet.
But I love the fact that back to the basics, right? I mean, without the basics in place, I think we can get distracted. I think we can get off onto paths that are not productive for us.
The only other thing I would say is that, if you're not doing these well, you're going to be very reactive, right? You're going to be dealing with problems that a lot of these processes are meant to mitigate, right? And so sometimes it is a challenge, right? If you're dealing with exceptions, all the exceptions in your supply chain, to put these processes in place, but very doable. Don't have to be, you don't have to go out and buy a bunch of advanced tools or technology, but they're really meant to mitigate things that you might anticipate happening in the future, right? So
great. Well, I'll tell you what, I'm gonna come over here and have you kind of walk us through what's shown here on the screen, Tim.
yeah, supply chain professionals, right? We know this, right? We know that supply chain is a cross-functional contact sport, right? Be it with your R&D team on new product development, sales and marketing, obviously with sales and demand planning, supply chain with your inventory procurement, and of course your finances, right? And there's a lot going on in your supply chain, right? You've got supplier management, inventory management, you got demand management, you've got transportation, you've got cycles of fulfilling orders and manufacturing items, et cetera. But really what our goal, I've lumped this into kind of three categories, right? Our goal is either to attain and grow revenue, manage assets, right? Be it your physical plant assets, and that includes your labor, machinery, equipment, also your inventory, right? Or we're trying to manage costs and margin on our products, right? So it's a very dynamic environment for most supply chain professionals and for organizations, distributors and manufacturers, that, I think we lose sight of the integrated nature of how these cross-functional areas, and the fact that we have to have cross-functional processes and alignment to attain the business goals that we have. So that's all this is trying to depict, where, revenue is typically left to the sales and marketing folks. We all know, as a supply chain, we need to be able to deliver that. Assets are certainly on the supply chain team. Costs and margin, that's for everybody, right? Either be it a pricing action, cost, and then of course your whole financial planning aspect of this with your cash flow and managing that. if you don't have an integrated process, it's pretty easy for these things to get disconnected. And next thing you know, we're trying to sell things that we don't have in inventory and vice versa, right? And we're not managing costs to the market. And we end up with challenges, right, in our business.
Yeah, great summary there. I'm reminded of this as we came into the pandemic. Even pre-pandemic, we were faced with a lot of tariffs. So if you talk about managing cost and margin,
Yep.
huge impacts, right? As we begin
Yep.
looking at the increased taxation on individual product. I think when the pandemic arrived, I think that caught a lot of people off guard from the standpoint that you saw a COVID bump, you saw a COVID slump, but all of a sudden, we were reaching and needing input from all of these different feedbacks in the organization. We saw some benefits come from the pandemic. A lot of organizations started to realize that this full contact sport became a full contact sport because it was needed, meaning we had no idea what was going on with demand, suppliers, and they began engaging. I love that. I love that full contact.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. All righty. Well, I'll tell you what, let's take this down and let's start talking about the management, the reporting, all of those other components involved in the supply chain and talking about that cross-functional. So if you'd be so kind as just to take us through this, Tim, and
Sure.
we'll piece it apart.
So this is really just a context slide around, most manufacturing companies probably have, have these core processes, right, at a high level, a lead to quote, an order to cash, where you've got your order fulfillment, forecasting, planning, procurement, right, procure to pay, which includes sourcing, your supplier management, just your supplier execution. Probably have some type of scheduling, order fulfillment, maybe an available to promise process, design to deploy, right? This is your new product development process. And then, of course, inventory management. So, as you look at these core processes and what you're trying to accomplish with your business, all of these break down into very, sequential, you can go in and look at different capabilities associated with each one of these streams of processes, but you also notice they're very cross-functional, right? If you just take forecasting and planning, this is meant to be a sales, marketing, kind of supply chain, manufacturing, financial management process, be it sales and operations planning, scheduling, material requirements planning. But the ones in green, to me, are really the ones that can make or break your business. And I think these core processes, organizations that had a much better integrated view of their business, I don't have any empirical research to support this, but I would imagine they did better during the pandemic, right? If you're in touch with your supplier base and you understand their operations just as well as you understand your own, you're having that contact with them, that ongoing dialogue about what's going on in your business, what's going on in their business. These these core processes can really add a lot of value. And as I like to say, especially in the forecasting and planning, all that is bringing the future into the present, right? So you can do something about it, right? And that's really the intent of looking at these cross-functional processes to manage the business. And these are the core. In my mind, these are the most important, some of the most important. We can talk about your warehouse strategy. We can talk about how you're doing order fulfillment, and those are all really important as well. But really, that's the execution of what you already put in place with these three areas.
Right. So you touched on something, Tim, in here, sales and operations planning, and related to the forecasting and the planning. And I see of all of these processes, it's the one that spans the majority of all of these cross-functional areas, right? Going all the way from sales, marketing, R&D, supply chain, manufacturing.
Yep.
What is your experience when you're out in the marketplace on the adoption of a process or these processes that you're talking about? Are they well adopted in the marketplace? Are people doing bits and pieces of them? What do you see when you go out and start working with your clients?
It's all over the map. The word I would use is fragmented. I would say if you just kind of broke it down to kind of like sales planning and demand planning, I would say smaller organizations, those under 100 million, I tend to see no demand process really in place. In fact, they don't even have, they might have an annual plan, but they don't really have a forecast per se. I would say that some of the tool sets are very antiquated, in the sense of, especially with maybe an older company, they might have some legacy tools that just aren't up to snuff, and they don't understand the value that they are in a position to take advantage of incremental technology, and they just haven't and been able to internalize that. So I would say like a cross-functional process like sales and operations planning, bits and pieces of information are flowing through the organization. There's typically not an integrated view of, if this is my demand plan and this is my supply plan, what's the impact on my financials, right? What's my cash flow look like? What's my margins look like? Where am I going to have those supply issues, right? Where might I have some risk in that? And, the other thing that we know is that, inventory management is not just about physical movement of inventory, but it's also about, what is my inventory strategy around my products, right? And that's a lot of what goes into a supply plan. So it's not very, I would just say most organizations don't do it very well, and they don't seem to value it. And one of the reasons is because their processes aren't great, and as a result, they're firefighting constantly, right? They're firefighting exceptions where they're misaligned with either demand coming in that they didn't plan, maybe some supplier issues that could have been anticipated weren't. They aren't in touch with how their suppliers are performing, and they certainly don't have a very sophisticated inventory management strategy to support that.
Great. Thank you for that, Tim. And I resonate with that as well. Oftentimes, my experience when we start working with our clients is the fact that oftentimes there are differing opinions on how we want to service. Sales typically is, I never want to stock out. Finance is typically, what can you do to reduce the levels of inventory that we're carrying? And then operations is caught in between.
Yep.
My experience has been,
and procurement, right? Like, I want the lowest price, but I don't want to run out, but that's maybe not what I need, right? It's the same dynamic across the procurement as well, because you don't want to be a buyer or procurement specialist and be the one that shuts down the line or can't fulfill an order, right? And so there's conflicting tension in this system as well, right? That's why you have to align your metrics, right, to what you're trying to accomplish.
great. Yeah, and in fact, that contact sport, these are never easy conversations because we do have differing opinions on where we want to be. Hence the need for everybody to come into alignment so that the operation ultimately will be in alignment with a plan.
Absolutely.
May not be my first choice, but we're in alignment with that. And again, yeah, great points. Tim, we had a question that came across here, and in our opinion, who has the greatest responsibility for forecasting and planning? The sales and the marketing teams, or the planning and the buying teams? Yeah, and why? Why would you say what you're saying?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because in fact, I just had an organization where this topic came up, and the director of supply chain wanted to source to a different plan, right? To a different demand plan. I don't think those decisions can be made in a vacuum. Ultimately, I believe the sales and marketing teams own the forecast. Okay. And I think that they've got to be able to forecast and defend their forecast. At the same time, I think the procurement, supply chain planning buyers, they are a check and balance, right, with that forecast, because I've being a planning manager myself in previous lives, seeing a forecast come across that just didn't quite make sense, right? And it was going to create some mostly upside requirements, right? It was going to create some real, financial challenges and maybe even some supplier challenges in getting enough parts to meet that forecast. So I do think that there's a collective check and balance there. I don't think operations just goes and executes the forecast, and I don't think that you just buy to support whatever the sales and marketing team gives you. Thus, the need to have a balanced conversation with, typically I see the finance community step in and they'll kind of break the tension up a little bit relative to inventory and financial goals, to kind of offset what procurement thinks or planning versus what the sales and marketing team thinks. But I do think sales and marketing owns the demand plan.
Okay. Yeah, great comments on that. And I like the checks and balances in here. That's that contact sport from the standpoint that the individual is responsible for execution on that plan, which is I'm going to go out and procure to this. They have a responsibility to the organization to highlight issues,
Yep.
potentially with supply. They also have that opportunity to say, help me understand why this demand plan is like it is. And I'm thinking in terms of oftentimes we will see, hey, our plan for growth this year is a 15% lift. And how are we going to accomplish that, right? Because based on what we've seen, we're seeing maybe a 5% lift year over year. What stands behind this increase in sales? Are you going to be doing promotions? And if you do, we better know about those so that we can get in front of those, especially with these long lead times.
Yeah, the ops team is depending on their metrics, right? A lot of ops teams have either cost or inventory level metrics, and I've been in situations where trying to meet a quarter end number. And this is probably more typical for public companies, but maybe not so much for private. But public companies, when you're reporting your financials to the street and you want to be able to demonstrate good fiscal management, you've got these inventory goals that you might have projected or forecasted or signaled to the market. And I've made decisions where I knew I was going to get dinked on inventory in that quarter, but I also knew I needed that inventory for the first week of the next quarter, right? To support customer service and revenue goals, right? So those are trade-offs that, have to be made in the business, right? And you can't silo your metrics. They have to be balanced. And, hopefully no one's making them in a vacuum. I think that's where the risk comes in, where no one someone's making a decision that like no one's aware of. That's when it becomes a problem. And that's why these cross-functional data sets and processes are so important.
Wonderful. Yeah, and certainly, Tim, we've talked a lot about the forecasting and the planning, the procure to pay, and then the inventory management. As we talked about this, there's a lot to dive into.
You bet.
In each one of these, but I think the main point that we wanted to get across today, and that Tim is sharing, is this is a contact sport. It's a team sport, ultimately, and we talk about this to our clients. There's one number that's the truth. Finance doesn't have one number that they operate on. Operations doesn't have another number, and sales another. We all need to be in alignment in all of this. The metrics help us stay on track. We have those metrics that are backwards looking. We also have looking through the windshield. I think some of these projections, part of the S&OP process, is what we're trying to do. I love your statement around all we're doing with planning is trying to bring the future into the present so that we can make decisions about that.
Look, most of us have lead times, right? We're dealing with, right? We all can't just, pump our system full of inventory to meet, customer requirements. And sometimes when people are starting out and maybe they're a younger business, younger being less than 10 years, and they really haven't got into a demand planning environment, at least I tell them, get a demand plan out covering your longest lead time, right? Because that, is at least going to be able to look at and say, oh, what do I need to execute to here as far as purchasing and some of those activities. You don't need to have a 2-year detailed month by, because hopefully you don't have lead times of 2 years. You might have had them during the pandemic, but and most lead times are in that, longest ones are, can be up to 12 months for some, high tech parts, but most are in that 3 to 6 month range and less, but at least cover that horizon so that you can, and we'll talk more about that as far as like planning horizons for your forecasting and planning process, on the next webinar.
Yeah, great lead into that, Tim. So I think as we're talking about this, key takeaways. So by the way, key takeaways that we would talk about in here also lead into making sure that you're attending these other sessions as we start peeling the onion on these and talking about these in detail. But Tim, if you want to just walk us down through what you would consider to be key takeaways here when we talk about back to the basics.
Assess these core cross-functional processes, right? Because you can create resiliency, you can meet your operational objectives if you just get back to some fundamentals. Or maybe it's not even getting back to them. Maybe it's, what are we doing with our forecast and planning processes, right? We're buying 10, 12, $15 million a year from the supplier. What are we doing with that supplier to ensure that they're being, they're in touch with our business, they're being successful, we want them to be successful. And where's, make an assessment, right? Inventory management, when we dive into that topic, we're going to talk about how are you setting your inventory goals relative to product, channel, your distribution network, et cetera. What is, the current process you have in place for this? What is your weakest link, right? Assess that and then get started. For me, if you don't have a sense of this, and you probably don't have a process associated with this, but get started. Even if your technology is not the latest and greatest, and I deal with 30-year-old ERPs, I deal with spreadsheets, I deal with basically technology that's not quite up to snuff, but get started with what you have, and go from there. But I really do think these fundamentals and these core processes are the key to creating resiliency, but also just managing your business.
You bet. And I want to talk about technology in here. Technologies have advanced and technologies afford a lot of opportunity. So when we talk about these processes, I typically think in terms of people, process, and tools. The tools are wonderful.
Yep.
Need our people trained, but it's really these processes that we are talking about in here to glue these things together. So we are fans of technology and that they can serve up information and KPIs, all of these types of things to assist us. What we're focusing on here, though, is what I would consider what glues them together, which is the core processes that we've laid these technologies over the top of.
I've seen over and over where the technology has actually done a disservice to the business because they didn't have that underlying process, right? The technology was doing X, Y, Z. And in some cases, if you don't implement it well, you don't understand the assumptions behind it. Statistical forecasting being an example, great tool, but you need to still manage and validate it, right? So, it's a great technology, but you still need to manage it. Yeah, I would start with your process, right? Start with your process, and then look for tools to meet those requirements, those process requirements.
Outstanding. Well, talking about that process, one of the decisions that we've made is the next 3 sessions in here, we're going to be diving into detail with respect to the most underrated process in here. And we're going to talk about that. We're then going to go to the path to supply chain resiliency, the holy grail of supply chain management. So this is a 3-part series. We've made it intentionally close together so that as you're walking down this path, we're revealing what we would consider to be leading practice. You can access by contacting StockIQ directly. I'll put up our email addresses here. We also do a weekly, so if you have these processes in place, we're also offering weekly demonstrations if you want to see some of the technologies around, for instance, demand and supply planning that we would consider leading practice. So with that being said, we want to thank you for joining us today. Here's my contact information. You can feel free to reach out to me and or Tim. We look forward to you joining us on these next sessions. Tim, I wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful blog about getting back to the basics. Really resonated with me, and thank you for your expertise today.
Oh, appreciate it, Jeffrey. Anytime. Enjoyed it. Look forward to the
Yes.
next 3 sessions.
Great. We'll see everybody next session. Thank you.